Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the single largest revolt by Jews against the Germans during World War II. Despite the tragic fate, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising fundamentally changed history for reasons you wouldn't expect. But what can it teach us about the human spirit of resistance, and how can it shed light on what's happening in Palestine right now?
What was it like to see Jews fighting Germans?
I don't think that it was a question at that point of Jews fighting Germans. It was us not going without resistance.
Let's go back in time. The Holocaust didn't happen in a historical vacuum, but was built on centuries of European anti-Semitism. Fueled by an ideology of supremacy, Nazi Germany's solution to the Jewish question was genocide. In 1939, Germany invaded and occupied Poland, triggering the start of World War II. As of the 1930s, about 3.5 million Jews lived in Poland, making it the largest community in Europe. And by the end of the war, 90% of them were killed. In occupied Poland, Germans instituted a policy of ghettoization as a preliminary step in its erasure of a people. Ghettos were small, segregated, and densely populated areas where people were forcibly transferred and isolated from the rest of society. The Jewish population in Poland was ethnically cleansed from different parts of the country and transferred to these ghettos. The Germans built thousands of them, but the largest was in Warsaw. The Warsaw Ghetto was 3.4 kilometers squared, and at its height housed almost 500,000 Jews. Jews were caged in, as Germans built 10-foot walls topped with barbed wire around the ghetto. No one could come in or go out, and anyone trying to escape was shot on sight. In the beginning, to create the illusion of self-government, the Germans established local Jewish councils and police to administer the ghettos, but that was only just another form of control. And once the roundups began, these authorities assisted the Germans. The ghetto was resource-deprived, and food was rationed. Jews lost their jobs and were put into forced labor. Economic conditions became dire. People lived in abject poverty, and tens of thousands died from disease and hunger. On a daily basis, Germans would kill people without much reason other than for being Jewish, and sometimes, at the end of the day, they would hold victory parties. Wait a second, don't these ghettos sound eerily familiar? Anyway, back to our story. Most people in the ghetto focus on just staying alive, but others wanted to organize and resist. As different forms of actions were discussed, armed resistance was rejected at first. People mainly feared the brutal collective punishment that could be unleashed by the Nazis, something that was seen time and time again. They believed the Germans were militarily superior and thus invincible. But things changed in the summer of 1942 in what the Germans called the Great Action, when over 250,000 men, women, and children were rounded up from the Warsaw Ghetto and deported for mass murder. Those horrors were a turning point. The Jews that remained mobilized and started to prepare their armed resistance. To navigate their heavily surveilled, controlled, and densely populated environment, the resistance built and organized in underground tunnels, bunkers, and sewers. They also used them to smuggle in weapons, ammunition, and resources. But because of limited supplies, the resistance also made its own makeshift weapons. In January 1943, while preparing for a military operation against the collaborator Jewish police, the Jewish resistance faced a second phase of German deportation, and for the first time, the Germans were met with armed resistance that foiled their plans.
Akcja była pierwsze trupy, nimb tego niezwyciężonego Niemca. Padł, że on może być zabity tak samo jak każdy człowiek na ulicy. Ich było zabitych 2 czy 3, czy rannych, to jest bez znaczenia.
The aura of German invincibility collapsed, and a psychological turning point took over the ghetto. People became determined and defiant, and support for the resistance increased. In April 1943, the Germans prepared for the final liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. Fortified in their bunkers and tunnels, the resistance was prepared, and after days of fighting, the Germans could not enter. Tanks were burned, and no German soldiers were left alive.
הגיבורים הגדולים הגרמנים נסוגו בפחד עצום בפני הרימונים היהודיים והפצצות היהודיות מתוצרת בית.
This was another major victory for the Jewish resistance. The Nazis were shaken and shocked. Unable to make progress in facing these losses, the Germans decided to burn the entire ghetto down while people were in it. They set the ghetto ablaze, and the combination of fires and German bullets ravaged everyone. Resistance continued sporadically until June, but then was completely extinguished. The ghetto was entirely destroyed, and 13,000 of the 57,000 people were killed during the uprising, and the rest faced deportation and extermination. Only some escaped to one day tell the the tale. This is what became known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Despite its tragic ending, it tells us a very important story. It showed that resistance to the Nazis was possible, and inspired resistance in partisan groups all over Europe to fight back and liberate their lands. It also reminds us that even in the face of certain death, in the most horrific conditions, facing a powerful adversary, people will still choose to resist. Why? Because it's part of human nature. See, the choice to resist in itself is a psychological reminder that we exist as human beings, whether it is to fight to live or refusing to be killed while silent. And no matter how dire the conditions become, or how overwhelming the violence is, like the Warsaw Ghetto, the choice cannot be crushed. My name is Salim, and I tell stories that connect the unexpected. Follow for more.